my whole life has been just gripped with the Skibicki trial, which of course Jeremy Skibicki is the admitted serial killer who has admitted that he killed 4 Indigenous women who we know the remains of 2 that are in landfills. There has been now further evidence within the trial that DNA of 12 women, one of whom went missing about the same time as the time in which these women were killed in March of 2022 to May of 2022. We know for a fact that Jeremy Skibicki has murdered women, and we know that there are DNA of women who we don't know who the identity of, and those who we do know the identity of, at least one of them are missing. So it's a story that has gripped the city. I was in the courtroom just a few weeks ago, and I'm part of the email thread with other reporters. And we get sent all the evidence, which you can just imagine how grisly and awful and horrific that is.
Kwe Nindeluizi Pam Palmater, and I'm the host of this show, The Warrior Life. I'm a lawyer, professor, author, and activist from Eel River Bar First Nation, and my motto is education for action on Indigenous rights, social justice, and protecting the planet. On this podcast, you'll get an education of a different kind, one that's enriched by the cultures, insights, and lived experiences of Indigenous peoples all over North America. They could be authors, artists, musicians, and academics, or leaders, activists, land defenders, and water protectors, all of whom are on the front lines of Indigenous resistance, resurgence, and cultural revitalization, each in their own way. And today's podcast is a superstar. You all know him, and he has been on this podcast many times, but this one is a little bit different, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the Warrior Life Podcast. I'm your host, Pam Palmater. I've got a question for all of you. It's going to sound maybe fictional or unbelievable, but trust me, it's true. What do you get when you cross a professor, an award-winning author, an award-winning columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press, a hardcore national political media commentator, and one of the most phenomenal speakers I've ever had the privilege to hear? Yeah, you know it. It's Dr. Niigaan Sinclair. Niigaan has a BA in education from the University of Winnipeg. He has a master's in Native and African American literatures from the University of Oklahoma, and he has a PhD in First Nations and American literature from the University of BC. And he's one of the smartest, sweetest, nicest people I know. He's kind, he's compassionate, and he's very generous. He supports everyone around him. The way he dedicates his life to educating the public on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, together with his contributions at the community level, are inspiring. I honestly don't know how he does it. How does he write books, and he has a new one, and teach and do all of these things all at once? I don't know. It's hard to even keep up with him. And he also volunteers for the Mama Bear Clan, taking care of our people on the streets. Personally, he's also been an incredible support person, and he's mentored me. I have learned so much from him. I like how we engage with one another and challenge each other's thoughts. And today's podcast is going to be no different. I asked my friend Niigaan to come back on the show to talk about current political issues, what's happening in Native country, for example. And what I really appreciate about this conversation, like so many others, is the way that we can agree or disagree on something, or take a slightly different approach, or interpret things differently. And we learn from one another. We don't take to social media and start trashing each other because we don't necessarily agree on everything. We listen and learn. Agreement is not necessary. though most of the times we pretty much agree on most things. This conversation is a perfect example of where he pushes me to think about things in a different way. I learn from him every time. Now, Niigaan was on the road, so he had to join me online super early in the morning from wherever he was to give us these really important updates about what's happening. So here we go. So Niigaan, I am so pumped to have you back, my friend. I am your biggest fan. You know this. Not in like the Stephen King misery kind of biggest fan, but obviously biggest fan because I love everything you do. And you're back at the Wînipêk Free Press. How's that feeling?
Well, thanks for having me back. And you need to find better people to look to, or you need to find better people to be fans of. But anyways, I'm back at the Free Press. I took about 6 months off. It was much needed. I'd written for about 5.5 years or so. Writing 1 or 2 columns a week. And then a few years ago, I was working on the editorials for the paper. And then all the different things that else I do for the paper. A lot of people probably don't know, behind the scenes, I'm doing trainings of the staff. I'm working with all the reporters on stories involving Indigenous peoples. And so there are dozens and dozens of stories that you would not know in the Free Press that I'm helping reporters with.
No.
And then on top of that, I do a lot of the public events for the Free Press. So when they do like a Meet the Reader night, I tend to go and do that stuff for the paper as well. So on top of my already existing job as a professor and doing a bunch of other things like working at the Forks in Winnipeg, it was very hard and exhausting. And so during the last phases of the book, which was the final edits and the audiobook, I just took those 6 months off to try to just breathe a bit.
Just a little tiny bit. And honestly, I'm your friend and I had no idea that you did all of those extra things. Plus, I have to say, you also do Niigaan and the Lone Ranger, right?
Yeah, that actually didn't stop the whole time, although we did slow down.
Okay.
We were doing the that's the podcast for the Winnipeg Free Press. And so I do that with my colleague Dan Lett, who's the political reporter, or one of the political reporters and columnist at the Winnipeg Free Press. Long-standing, he is what I call Dan is he's kind of like the foundation of Winnipeg politically. He connects with everybody. He talks to all the political parties. And so for weeks leading into the provincial election, where Wab Kinew was voted in as the new premier, first First Nations premier in Canadian history of a province, we did a pod every single week, and we were interviewing people from all different parties, all different. Actually, it's not true. The Conservative Party wouldn't come on our show, but they did send people who were affiliated with the Conservative Party. So we had a senator on to speak about provincial Conservative policy and that kind of thing. Anyways, so we were covering the election very heavily, and I would say we're the only pod that was really doing anything around the provincial election, which was one of the most important in our provincial history. And on top of that, by far the most racist provincial election in Canadian history, because it had all about the landfill search.
Yeah, exactly. And how the former government was not just anti-landfill, but hey, let's take out billboards. Let's make this our election campaign. Like, I've never seen anything like that. I've seen racism in politics, but wow. And you know what makes me happy? Sometimes I get depressed about, reconciliation, and sometimes there's hate groups out there. And then I think, but look at Manitoba. They overwhelmingly kicked out a racist government and put in WAP. Like, what? Like,
Well,
that's history.
I mean, it was a bit tighter than that. I mean, it looked a little overwhelming, I think,
Yeah.
because that's the way the parliamentary system works. People
Yeah.
vote for seats; they don't vote in the majority of the election. But 200,000 votes, which was definitely closer to makes the election a lot closer than you'd think.
Okay.
Had voted for the Conservative Party. Most of that was rural or in their kind of base seats in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
who are now under duress. Actually, there is a very interesting by-election about to happen in Winnipeg in the riding formerly held by former Premier Heather Stephenson, what's called Tuxedo, which is, just as the name infers, one of the richest seats or one of the richest ridings in Manitoba. That's actually competitive for the NDP for the first time in decades, because I think of the popularity of WAB and the NDP, or
Mhm.
Premier Canoe and the NDP. You have to remember, I think, that Manitoba is also the site where you see the most amount of votes for the People's Party. That's Maxime Bernier's party. And so there certainly is, that's in Portage la Prairie. He actually ran for that federal seat during a by-election, and was competitive in ish in that seat.
Yeah.
And so Manitoba's a complicated place. It's a place
Mhm.
where you see a lot of people who have some pretty stringent, hard views, especially when it comes to Indigenous peoples, or things like vaccine or freedom. And
Oh,
then,
yeah.
of course, then you have this very progressive, by far unprecedented kind of vision of politics that Premier Canoe and his cabinet are bringing to Manitoba. Really has never been seen before, this kind of interesting bridging of quite sort of center politics, center business politics, but then also a real social justice bend that has
Mhm.
economically seems to be working for Manitoba right now. There was at one point that Manitoba was leading the slowdown of inflation and the kind of bounce back from the pandemic, leading the country. And I mean, when do you ever see that before? Normally it's Alberta, normally it's Ontario.
Yeah. Yeah.
Manitoba's actually leading financially most of the country for a little while, just back a few months ago.
Nice. And obviously, all over TikTok, all over social media is Premier Wabkanu dancing in at the Manitowabi Festival. And, just for me, even something like that being so historic, you just wouldn't see that. You might see a politician, like at powwows, they might walk in at grand entry, but to know that the premier is native and is dancing in, and he's been dancing his whole life, and just to see that was something else, I have to say. Like, I don't know when we'll see that anywhere else anytime soon, but I'm glad it was Manitoba.
I'm actually going to argue that there is a trend that's happening in Manitoba that perhaps suggests the country might see some sort of movement. And what I mean is that we know that the fastest growing population is Indigenous peoples. We know that the average age of those Indigenous peoples who are coming are between the age of 15 and 30. And so Manitoba is really ground zero for that growth. And so this past election, last October, you saw 20,000 first-time voters were Indigenous peoples who turned 18 for the very first time. That's that huge group that I'm talking about. They were all born approximately around 2000, 2, 3, 4, and then they all grew 18 at the same time. And that meant that they voted for the very first time in a provincial election. And what happened? Well, Premier Wab Canoe, that's not the only reason, of course, that the NDP won, but I think it's significant because what it tells you is that Indigenous peoples are becoming a very significant political force, and they're participating in Canadian democracy. That might be a little different than it is in the past, especially with our ancestors, even ourselves, even our own generation. I think we were resistant in many ways to participate. And so what you're seeing in Manitoba is the rise of progressive politicians who have to appeal, who have to engage, who have to work with Indigenous voters, Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations. And it's very significant because the indication of that was Wab didn't just appoint himself as provincial premier, or obviously not appointing himself, but was voted as provincial premier. But he appointed himself in the cabinet as Minister of Indigenous Reconciliation, typically known as Indigenous Affairs or Northern Affairs or those kinds of things. Having a premier that is both head of the province and head of working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations, that's never happened before. And so that means that two things. One is that business looks different in Manitoba.
Mhm.
because of the proportional population, because we have 63 First Nations, because we have this very burgeoning, exploding Métis population in Manitoba, which is very powerful, very wealthy. They're buying up buildings, all the Métis Federation, Manitoba Métis Federation, by the Red River Métis, and establishing a national government in quite a strong fashion. They're a very strong political force. But it also tells you that lithium is on the horizon, that the creation and the commodification of resources in Manitoba is on the horizon, is going to be necessary to include Indigenous peoples. Never mind the fact that the most important investments in Winnipeg's future are all going to be Indigenous. That's the Noe-O-Dana project on Route 90. That's the Hudson Bay development project by the Southern Chiefs. That's the new museum downtown by the Manitoba Métis Federation. And the fact that the Manitoba Métis Federation just bought one of the biggest buildings, a former bank, in the downtown core. And so what I'm trying to say is that this is Indigenous peoples is where it's at in Manitoba. And so you have to have a premier who's on top of that.
Well, it's exciting. Like, all of it's exciting. And I'm not naive enough to think that, oh, we're going to always agree on everything any native political leader does in whatever position, whether they're a senator, an MP, an MPP, a premier. But just to me, it's very historic. I'm hoping it's a sign. I'm going to believe in you, Niigaan.
One already happening in Saskatchewan, largest slate of urban reserves. Northwestern Ontario, they're getting on board with urban reserves and coming to a realization that that proportional population in places like Thunder Bay people have to engage that. And I think that there's pockets elsewhere, Edmonton, Calgary, and then even eventually, places already are happening, like where I am right now, Niagara Falls, places like London, Guelph. These are very high proportion Indigenous areas that are going to eventually have to look like what Manitoba looks like now.
Well, that's good news. That's good news. And it's about time. And so, are these some of the things that you're writing about in your new column? Like, what's happening in Manitoba right now? What are the biggest issues that everybody's watching?
My whole life has been just gripped with the Skibicki trial, which, of course, Jeremy Skibicki is the admitted serial killer who has admitted that he killed 4 Indigenous women who we know the remains of 2 that are in landfills. There has been now further evidence within the trial that DNA of 12 women, one of whom went missing about the same time as the time in which these women were killed in March of 2022 to May of 2022. We know for a fact that Jeremy Skibicki has murdered women, and we know that there are DNA of women who we don't know who the identity of, and those who we do know the identity of, at least one of them are missing. So it's a story that has gripped the city. I was in the courtroom just a few weeks ago, and I'm part of the email thread with other reporters. And we get sent all the evidence, which you can just imagine how grisly and awful and horrific that is. But that's the number one thing that I keep an eye on every day. I check to see what happened in the trial the day before. So the Crown just finished their case, and so the trial is a week break now, while the defense prepares their element of their defense for Skibicki, which is not that he didn't do the murders, because he's admitted to it. It's that he's not criminally responsible due to mental illness. And so you're going to see in about a week and a bit or so, you're going to see the defense present a witness that's going to argue. It's going to be a very brief defense. It's probably going to be only about a week, but they're going to offer a psychologist or psychiatrist that's going to argue that he's unwell, and that he was unwell at the time of the killings. The fact is, it's very traumatic. And here's how traumatic it is for everybody in Manitoba. Former Premier Heather Stephenson, who we just talked about a minute ago, was the head of the Conservative Party. She ran an election campaign saying she was not going to search the landfill. She got appointed to the board of WestJet and was, I believe, about 24 or 48 hours ago. And that's all anybody wanted to talk about at the paper. And readers who emailed me, including center members of the NDP, who were like, "You're going to write about this, right? How dare they do this during the trial? How dare Heather Stephenson come out and work for WestJet?" Like WestJet, I mean, we all know politicians work after they run for politics. And good, bad, great, ugly, Heather Stephenson is going to be a part of Manitoba. And so the fact that she can't go on the WestJet board, I think just tells you, or that people think, oh, that's inappropriate or that's shocking. I'm not here to tell you whether it's good, bad, or great, ugly. I'm not going to write about that. But I'm here to tell you that people are deeply, deeply invested in the trial and anything around it, including a former premier that then moves on and does something else with their career.
I don't know. I can't help but think about timing. It's one thing to make a decision that we might or might not like, but I don't know. Who works in the PR and communications in all of these companies that do these kinds of things at the most inopportune times? Honest to goodness, I'm not surprised people are upset about that.
Yeah, like speaking of, I cannot think of anything more. I mean, when would it be a good time, really? But so yesterday, I'm in Niagara. I'm working with high school students right now on reconciliation. I'm making this presentations to a series. I'm going to cover about 4,000 or 5,000 high school students over the next few days. Today's day 2. I mean, who's does PR for the RCMP? Like what are? I mean, I guess there's never going to be a good time because the RCMP inevitably is an organization whose only job has been to coerce, to over police, over surveil, harm Indigenous communities. And yesterday they released the new skirt or ribbon skirt that RCMP officers are permitted to wear with an eagle staff. And it's like one of those things where I do appreciate the work of people who I've worked with in the RCMP. I'm not going to say all people in the RCMP are bad people, because I will say that there are many people, Indigenous peoples including, who have done some important work to help our communities. And the fact is that the RCMP hasn't done all terrible work. They have worked to assist and engage and at times protect our communities. But there is such a long history of violence in the RCMP and our communities and our nations. Like, at what point will there just be like, just be quiet, just step, we don't need to see RCMP officers wearing the red coats that have represented the removal of our children to residential schools, who are the people who removed our children, came with the priests. They were the ones who threatened our families with jailing if they didn't send the children to residential schools. And now they get to wear a ribbon skirt. It's a terrible look. It's a terrible, like, who's counseling people? Like you don't get to suddenly slap reconciliation and on your history of the RCMP without a whole lot of reparations and restitution. Like, how about a sorry first? How about a recognition of the harm that you've created and are still creating within our communities? How about just a break? How about just take some time to create positive relationships for a few decades, and then maybe we could talk about ribbon skirts and eagle staffs.
It is mind-boggling because I can't imagine. So are all the RCMP who are violently arresting the people in Wet'suwet'en territory still, or in my territory still, are they going to be going to the job in ribbon skirts? I mean, there's just so much work to do before you could ever get to that stage. And I would argue, probably out of respect, you probably should never get to that stage.
Like, I think if there's anything our communities have shown is that we are resilient. We offer a headdress to a pope. Like, it's not sorry, that was Wilton Littlechild offering his personal headdress to the Pope. But I think that was a significant moment. Like, I'm not here to judge Wilton Littlechild or to say it was wrong. I am here to say that I am sick and tired of institutions taking our most traditional sacred objects, our most important items that we know in our languages have life, like an eagle staff, and then say, oh, well, we get to carry this too. No, because that's earned You have to earn it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what that's what everything in our lives are: drums, names. uh the eagle staff is something that you earn, because the migizi miguan, which are hanging off those feathers, they represent leadership that has been presented to you by communities. And I would say that, on the crests of that eagle staff are supposed to be all the different provinces or representations of different nations. Or I'll tell you this: I'm going to guarantee to you that 90% of those nations are not comfortable with you having an eagle staff with their crest on it. Like, did you ask permission? Did you offer tobacco? Did you sit in ceremony? Like, I'm going to guarantee you didn't. And probably most of all, then it just becomes basically on the realm of a dream catcher at Walmart. Like, it loses its value because it's something that people are using, and it doesn't represent the relationships that what those things are meant to represent. They're meant to represent, like when we have our objects, they're meant to represent connection. So that being said, you can obviously tell that I'm forming probably a column out of this. It's just extremely disappointing.
Yeah.
It's not just disappointing; it's enraging that you would see. I remember back when we banned the headdress, and I say we, meaning we worked with the Winnipeg Jets, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, because people were wearing headdresses at hockey games, identifying with some hockey team from Chicago or whatever. And so we said that that's inappropriate, because that's a sacred item that should only be used for recognition of the spirit and of leadership and of the land. None of those contexts exists within a drunken melee hockey game that is in the downtown of Winnipeg or Chicago or elsewhere. So we ban those headdresses at the Winnipeg Jets games. The Winnipeg Jets staff don't let those headdresses come in. And unfortunately, no one else has picked up that in the NHL. But that's, reconciliation is about we take care of our own areas, and we can't control what happens in those in other territories.
Yeah, that's so true. But so glad that you at least take that up in your realm. And so let's move on to something much happier, much more exciting before we have to end the podcast. I cannot talk about anything else right now except your new book. It's called Wînipêk. I've got the picture of the book up there. I don't have a copy yet because although some people are able to get contraband copies of this book, I have not been able. Everything's on pre-order. You're not allowed to get it until a certain date. So tell us all about this exciting book and why there's contraband.
So we had the Indigenous Literary Studies Association gathering. I'm the president of that. For a few more weeks, I'm president. But part of being the president is that you organize the gathering. So we brought it to Winnipeg. We had over 125, 30 scholars, writers, elders from all across North America, Turtle Island, who came to Winnipeg. We had an amazing gathering last week. Where people were talking about literature, they were talking about writing. We presented all these different books, one of which was mine, but there's many others that were presented at that gathering. And so what happened is that the company in Winnipeg, the independent bookstore in Winnipeg, McNally Robinson, who I'm very close with, they're great people. They do amazing work to support Indigenous literature. They even have their own printing press in the store so people can print their own books. So a lot of elders have actually done that, have produce stories for their grandchildren. And so McNally Robinson started to sell the books. And what happened was that sort of leaked out across to different bookstores across Canada, who then started to sell the books as well. And they're not supposed to sell it until May 28th, but they kind of just asked McClellan Stewart, hey, can we sell for just a couple days during this gathering? And of course, yes, and it makes sense. There were hundreds of people there who wanted a copy. I was right there. I could sign it right there. And anyways, this whole thing has become a bit of a funny debacle because then people across the country are like, oh, why do these people in Winnipeg have a copy of the book? Anyways, and then people like yourself have ordered it online, and they're like, we don't get it until May 28th when it actually is supposed to be released. So anyways, I just happy everybody reads it. I've seen it I've seen copies floating around. I'll say this: I do not have a copy of it. I don't have a copy of my own book. I have it on PDF, but I don't have a copy. Like, they're supposed to mail me a box to give away to my family friends. I've never received it, so I've never received a box of my own books. So I don't have any copies, but other people have them.
Okay, then I'll accept that I don't have one yet. But let's talk about what it's about, because it's the subtitle is Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Centre. So let's just imagine I don't know anything about you or where you're from, or Winnipeg or its history. What can people find in this book?
So I'll start out with the name. So Wînipêk is the original Cree name of not the city, but of the lake. And so Lake Winnipeg. And what that refers to is actually the watershed. So the watershed, and people will read this in the introduction, the watershed of Winnipeg goes all the way to Northern Ontario, into Michigan, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, all the way around to Alberta, to Saskatchewan, into the Northwest Territories, Nunavut. And so everything flows into the lake. And so that's really what the book is about. The book is about ecology and relationships in a space. So it's not just about the city, even though that's kind of where most of the attention and where most of my attention is paid, because Winnipeg is what I argue to be the site of the most important project in Canada's future. And people like to sort of spend a lot of time obsessing about Winnipeg across Canada. So you most famously saw Toronto reporters come in, do a big, huge cover story in Maclean's magazine. Winnipeg's the most racist city in the galaxy, blah, blah, blah. And then you'll also see these other stories, which are more recent, which is like, Winnipeg's the coolest city. There's the best place to live. And then you'll always see, like, at the same time, usually that week, some report will come out to say Winnipeg's the most violent city, or Murder Peg, or things like that. My argument is that Winnipeg is ground zero for what has been 150 years of violence, but as a result, 150 years of solutions. And so I think the most amount of solutions to what this thing called reconciliation, or most importantly, Indigenous and Canadian relationships, you will find more solutions in Winnipeg than almost anywhere else, because we've been at this the longest. We are the first footsteps of Confederation after Confederation. And so, and going for, nearly 200 and plus years, over, the first kind of British settlers, because the French had been there for decades, but the first British settlers kind of show up in the late 1700s, and the Hudson Bay Company, and they also bring a terrible smallpox epidemic, which spreads throughout Manitoba and devastates communities. And so there's this kind of, since about 1780, there's been this kind of investment in each other in Manitoba, which eventually will become the Selkirk Treaty, which is my community's treaty, first treaty in Western Canada, what's now Western Canada. And then, of course, Treaty 1, Treaty 2, which are negotiated just in a few weeks, the Manitoba Act, which is just before that. These are all things that are extremely significant. They're extremely violent, Manitoba Act in particular, because it dispossesses the Métis. But then on top of that, you see all of these solutions emerge. The Métis come up with their own solutions on the Red River to try to figure out, and the burgeoning of culture as a result, like the birth of an entire nation and culture through that interaction with Indigenous and Canadian people. And then, of course, the various ways that treaty nations, after having endured terrible violence, are now coming forward to make the largest investments in a Canadian city in North American history, almost. Like, I mean, some U.S. tribes are very wealthy, but like the 7 First Nations that are then eventually making this huge development on Route 90 in Winnipeg is the most progressive, most self-supporting and sustainable project that's going to be in Winnipeg history. It's going to save the city, really. And so while most prairie cities are fading and decaying, Winnipeg is going to be this new site of almost exclusive Indigenous investment, and it's going to revolutionize the city. And every single person in Manitoba, because of the population is 20% Indigenous in Manitoba and about 14% in Winnipeg, that means every single person works with, lives beside, or is married to an Indigenous person. And that means that you can't ignore each other. Like, you have to talk about it. You have to talk about the fact that racism, violence, poverty, addictions, these are disproportionately Indigenous, over policing. The fact that women are in landfills, and that, like, every Winnipegger knows about that. They care in different ways, but they know about it. It's not like Toronto or Vancouver, where people can spend their whole lives pretending like they don't have relationships with Indigenous peoples when they do. In Winnipeg, it's in your face. It's innate. And that means that everybody's talking about something, not in the same way, but they're talking about it. And that's what the Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Centre looks like. So there's 80 columns that I wrote over about 5 years. It's actually, that's only about a quarter of all the columns I've written. I've written over 500. So I picked 80 that I sort of identified the different things that are happening in Wînipêk. Remember, it's the watershed. So I also wrote about my hometown of Selkirk. I wrote about the Interlake. I wrote about Brandon. I wrote about things that are also outside in, like, Upper Canada or Canada at writ large. Talk about Treaty 3, Northwestern Ontario. Talk about Saskatchewan. Colton Bushy is a big part of the book as well. And so I'm talking about all these things that kind of go into a sense of relationship that then is manifested in everyday life in Winnipeg through my experience, through my daughter's experience, through my friends and family, and then, of course, through my colleagues at the Free Press. There's really great photographs that all of my colleagues, all of whom are Canadian, but are taking amazing photographs about the kind of complexity. There's a really beautiful photograph that was taken about during Idle No More, which shows up in the book as well, that kind of just identifies to you the complexity of Winnipeg. And yeah, that's, so, there's 80 columns, and they're split up into a kind of a year. So even though I did them over 5 years, I split them up into kind of seasons. And so I start with thinking about the ways in which a kind of year operates in Winnipeg. And I give people a kind of sense of this is what life is like. This is the cycle of Winnipeg. It kind of goes violence, and then engagement, and then I wouldn't call it consultation, but people kind of coming up with the creative solution, and then they employ that solution, and then they start again. Then violence, and then discussion, figuring it out, employ. And that's kind of what, and I use, for instance, the Mama Bear Clan a fair bit, that I do a lot of walking for, patrolling for. I'm a captain of that group. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that I cover. I cover trials. I cover the people who are found in difficult addictions, people who go to beauty pageants. I cover it all.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot because we're recording and I can. What are the chances that I can get you back to do a live event about your book, so that all the people who have read it or want to read it can ask you questions about it and maybe hear you do a reading from it?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I'll give you a little preview right now of what I don't have a copy here because I don't have copies yet. But what I would say is the way that I start the book and the way that I end the book, I think, is kind of those organic kind of spiritual moments, right? Mm-hmm. So the way that I start the book is I talk about the fact that for decades, people in Winnipeg were asking for a statue or a monument or a memorial, a recognition of some way of First Nations contributions to Manitoba. So at the Manitoba legislature on Broadway Avenue in Winnipeg, there was no recognition of Indigenous, First Nations people. There was recognition of Métis, there was recognition of French and British, and of course, all the people that fought in World War I and World War II. There's a big statue of Queen Victoria right in the front, big statue of Queen Elizabeth. And then, of course, there's like Ukrainians, there's people who Icelandic people. Then there was even a statue for the guy who was the impetus or the inspiration for James Bond, like at the Manitoba legislature, but no recognition of First Nations. So for decades upon decades, people asked, and then one day on Canada Day of 2021, people just installed one. And they did it by taking a colonial statue of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth and deciding we're going to put a recognition of First Nations contribution. And they did that for free. Didn't cost the taxpayers a dime. And so people should have celebrated, but they didn't. The premier freaked out. Boris Johnson, the UK prime minister, freaked out. The world kind of freaked out and cared about statues, which they never even cared about statues before. And so I start the book with that. And then I go all the way up to the 2023 October election, provincial election, where the province puts in not just a monument, not just a statue, but a real life First Nations person as the premier.
Well, that just sounds epic, just that alone. So I am so excited to have you back, do a special live event to talk about your book. I'm assuming that after May 28th, all of these books will start being sent, the ones that are pre-ordered. They'll be available probably in most bookstores, and I'm assuming all over Winnipeg.
I hope so. I mean, I was told they're going to end up in airports, so I don't really know what that means.
Nice. Okay.
In airports, so
We'll know. You and I will know. We'll be the first to know if they're being sold in airports.
Yeah, it's airport alert, everybody. If you see one in an airport, please send me a picture.
That's awesome. Well, Niigaan, thank you so much for doing this last minute, for taking the time, for always making time for the podcast, for people, for writing, sharing your knowledge, your experience, for always being hopeful. You're the awesome counter to my cranky pessimism sometimes. You're like the perfect balance. You've got it. You inspire people to do better. So thank you so much.
I think you're just catching me after a cup of coffee, and so I don't feel so depressed. Because when I wake up, I'm pretty much like, I hate the world, and why am I doing all these things? Why don't I just go back to bed?
Well, okay. Well, I got you at the right time. Just reminder, I'll do it every time after you've had your coffee.
I think every time I've been on the podcast, it's been some very early hour, I think. So I think people are getting a really mutated. We should do this pod at, let's say, 10 at night, and when I'm really just angry at the world, and we'll see what happens.
Oh gosh, I think I'd be even worse. But yeah, let's do that as an experiment, midnight or something crazy. All right. Well, thank you so much, Niigaan. Can't wait to have you back. We'll be promoting your book, sharing your links, doing everything we can to make sure everyone in Canada reads this amazing book.
Oh, Miigwech, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I hope everybody enjoys the book. And if you don't, my name's Wab Canoe. No, I'm just joking.
Send all of your complaints to Premier Wab Canoe.
Thanks for having me. And like this book has been, if I didn't have the great people at McClellan and Stewart, like especially I have an editor over there, Haley Cullingham, and Haley actually really did the lion's share of this book. Like she went on the Free Press website, sort of helped me pick all the columns, and then we just kind of put them all together. And so Haley really is the person, and Haley definitely would be watching this right now. So I think Haley deserves a lion's share. I give a big thanks to Haley in the acknowledgements, but Haley is really the superstar. And then my cousin Stephanie, who's at the time was my agent, is now doing a lot of leadership at McClellan and Stewart as the publisher. So those two people are just monumentally responsible for this, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Steph, who I already know, and thank you, Haley. I can't wait to meet you. We'll have to do a big celebration. Okay, Niigaan, I know you got to run, but thank you so much.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks for having me.
Thank you all to the Warrior Life podcast listeners for tuning into my show. I'll be sure to post links to all of Niigaan's content in my show notes, including his books, his podcast, his Winnipeg Free Press columns, and everything that he does. If you like this episode, please consider supporting my podcast by subscribing, liking, and sharing each episode and giving good reviews. If you want more information about any of these issues that we talked about, check out my website at pampalmater.com. You can also check out all my other podcasts, documentaries, and media projects that I have on the go at warriorlifestudios.com. Till next time, keep living a warrior life. Walaaliag.